What secret would ruin your life if exposed? I don't know why I'm writing this now. Maybe it's because after all these years, I haven't been able to tell anyone. This secret I'm holding on to could destroy my entire life. If it ever came out, I'd lose my friends, my job, and maybe even my freedom. And yet, I feel like I have to share it somewhere, or I'll explode inside. So here it is. Years ago, I worked as a personal assistant for a wealthy and influential family. Let's call them the K family. My job involved all kinds of tasks, organizing events, managing their travel plans, and sometimes doing things that, well, weren't exactly legal. But I never asked questions, because they paid me well, and there were perks to working for such a powerful family. The real trouble started when Mrs. K, the matriarch of the family, assigned me to organize an especially important dinner. She told me this wasn't just any event. The business partners attending that night would be making billion-dollar decisions. One guest in particular, let's call him Mr. Z, stood out from the rest. Mrs. K hinted that she had a long-standing grievance with him and assured me my only concern was to ensure the evening ran smoothly. At the time, I had no idea that within the span of one night, I'd uncover a secret that would change my life forever. Organizing the dinner took weeks, and Mrs. K oversaw every detail. From the table decorations to the menu selection and even the seating arrangement, everything required her approval. She described this as more than just a business dinner, it was a strategic meeting where major decisions about the future would be made. What struck me as odd was how polite Mrs. K was about every guest, except for Mr. Z. Whenever she mentioned him, there was a tone of bitterness in her voice. It was clear she held some deep resentment toward him, though she never elaborated. All I knew was that Mr. Z was one of the wealthiest people in the world and a key figure at the dinner. On the day of the event, Mrs. K gave me a strange and specific instruction. She wanted me to ensure that Mr. Z's glass always remained in its designated spot and that no one else touched it. I didn't ask why, she was the boss, and I just did what I was told. But her request started to make me suspicious. As the dinner began, everything seemed perfect on the surface. The guests chatted, the food was exquisite, and the atmosphere was elegant. But I noticed Mrs. K's gaze never left Mr. Z. It was as if she was stalking prey, and he had no idea he was in danger. Something was wrong, and I could feel that the next few hours would bring something terrible. The dinner was nearing its peak when Mrs. K asked me to fetch another bottle of wine from the cellar. As I returned, I saw her seated at the table, seemingly pouring something into Mr. Z's glass. Her expression was cold and determined, as though she knew exactly what she was doing. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to do. I tried to keep my composure, continuing my duties as if I hadn't seen anything. But the knot in my stomach told me that something was seriously wrong. For the rest of the evening, I kept a close eye on everything, noticing that Mr. Z's glass never left his place and was only handled by him. When Mr. Z finally reached for his glass, I made a split-second decision. Distracting one of the servers, I managed to swap his glass with an identical one before he took a sip. My heart was pounding as I watched him drink. His expression didn't change, and I knew the poisoned drink had been avoided. Mrs. K observed the entire scene, and although she didn't show it openly, there was a tension in her face as Mr. Z continued the evening unharmed. There was no doubt in my mind, if she realized I had interfered, she wouldn't show me any mercy. The rest of the evening was filled with tension. Mr. Z, unaware of what had transpired, carried on as usual, but Mrs. K grew colder, especially toward me. I knew she had noticed something but kept her silence for now. After the dinner, Mrs. K was unusually quiet and didn't call me in for our usual post-event discussions. This unnerved me. The sense that I was constantly on the brink of being discovered gnawed at me. The next morning, however, nothing happened, at least not outwardly. Days passed, and one morning I arrived at work to find the police at the door. Accompanied by Mr. Z, they announced they were launching an investigation. Mr. Z had suspected someone tried to poison him, as a toxic substance had been detected in his system during routine tests. While it wasn't lethal, it was clear someone had tampered with his drink, possibly before I had intervened. Mrs. K remained calm on the surface, but was visibly tense. I knew the police digging deeper would eventually put me in the spotlight. As the investigation progressed, more details about Mrs. K's shady dealings began to emerge. It became evident that she had used similar intimidation tactics against other business rivals. Meanwhile, I found myself increasingly cornered, knowing the events of that dinner held the key to everything. One evening, Mrs. K summoned me to her office. The room was cold and dimly lit, with only the desk lamp casting a glow. "I know the police are eyeing you," she said icily. "And I know you saw something that night. If you say anything to them, I guarantee you'll lose more than just your job, you'll lose your freedom." That night, I couldn't sleep. If I stayed silent, Mrs. K would remain a threat. But speaking up would make me a target as well. In the end, I decided to come clean. I arranged a private meeting with Mr. Z and told him everything I knew. Working with the police, we gathered evidence against Mrs. K, including her actions during the dinner. Mrs. K was arrested and faced severe charges, including attempted murder and corporate fraud. The case dragged on for months, but eventually, I was free from her looming shadow and able to start over. Even now, though, I get a sinking feeling in my stomach whenever I think about that night. One wrong move could have changed the course of my life forever.